everyone, and thank you very much for coming. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. We're all here to talk to Suhaila Abdullalee about her fantastic book that I hope you've all read. If you haven't, make sure you get a copy before you leave. What we talk about when we talk about rape. We'll get started in just a moment. Just a couple of things I want to say first. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to add that every single person in here, obviously myself included, who is not of the First Nation people are the beneficiary of atrocities in Australia. And as much as we all continue to benefit from those atrocities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to suffer from it. We can acknowledge it, that's a step, but words are useless without action behind it, and we can all do more. The only other thing I want to say, I presume most of you know, given Suhaila's title of the book, it's not really hiding it. We are going to be talking about rape tonight. That can sometimes be unexpectedly distressing. If you start to feel yourself getting tense, we've got Gabs and Stella up the back. They've got rooms that you can go to calm down if you need to. Or the other thing that I tell people also is if you start to feel yourself getting a bit tense, just pull out your phone and look at Twitter or Facebook. People will just think you're live tweeting it and we won't be able to see you, so you'll be fine. So I'll start asking Suhaila questions in a moment, but I just wanted to say, when I picked up this book, on page 1 of the introduction, that was when I was thinking, okay, this is going to be an amazing book. I can't wait to read the rest of it. Was this sentence talking about rape. It's the only crime that is so bad that victims are supposed to be destroyed beyond repair by it, but simultaneously not so bad that the men who do it should be treated like other criminals. To me, that summed up all the complexities and nuances of the things that we don't talk about when we talk about rape. So I firstly wanted to say thank you very much for writing such a wonderful book. So the history for anybody who doesn't know it is that you wrote an article for a women's magazine 30 years ago after this experience, after it happened to you. The article was published, it was read a bit, 30 years later it came roaring back and went viral. And then you wrote an article for the New York Times about that experience, and then you wrote this book, and now you're travelling around the world talking about this book. But you had that 30-year gap where you've written about in the book that you went on, you have a great life, you have a wonderful time, that was in the past as much as it could be, and you were living in the present as much as you can. So at some point you had to make a choice of whether you were going to go down the path you did, writing for the New York Times, writing this book, or leaving it in the past. What led you to make that decision?
Well, it wasn't that much of a choice, only because I didn't choose for the article to come back. So I just want to say that it wasn't that I had forgotten about the rape or not been interested in the topic. I kind of worked with rape on and off all my life, but it was just one of those things that I was very fascinated by. And I was lucky enough to have so much support that I managed to integrate it pretty well into my own life. But then this article that I had written when I was 20, long before the internet, suddenly appeared all over the world on the internet when there was a rape and murder in India in 2012. If you all, I'm sure you remember, in December 2012. And the media, as media does, was looking for a rape victim to interview and couldn't find one because I was still the only person who'd ever talked about it. So somebody found this article and posted it. And then I didn't have a choice because suddenly the whole world was calling and wanting a statement or something. And it felt sort of uneasily like the original act where you lose control and you just don't know what to do. So I did make a choice to write for the New York Times, but the choice was that, do I let this thing control me and let that thing I wrote 35, whatever, how many years ago it was, be my last word, or make a new statement? And I felt like I wanted to make a new statement because I was a different person. I wasn't the defiant 20-year-old. I was this, I keep hitting the mic. I was this, grown-up person who had things to say later. So it was kind of taking it, so it was a choice, but kind of began with a not choice.
Okay, and so it was that thing where something is imposed upon you and then you choose where it goes from there. Is that
kind of like
what you
rape?
mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking the analogy's getting uncomfortably close. How do you feel about it now? Are you glad that you've had that opportunity to talk to the world about what you know, or do you wish it had just never happened?
No, in the beginning I wish it had never happened because I really do. I'm a writer, I write different things, and I didn't want to be put into that thing of the rape victim of India. But then when it happened and I wrote the piece, then I thought I'm done. But I wasn't done. I was back into the pit of being rape victim. So then I worked really hard for 5 years to write other things, and I had a great time. I wrote a newspaper column. I wrote different things. It was also really good for our family because we hadn't, even though it wasn't a secret, it was kind of so much in the background that with my mother and brother, we hadn't really ever talked about it. And when it came to the front like that, it was a reckoning for all of us. So it was nice to get through it that way as grown-ups. But then I found I couldn't get away because every time I gave anyone a book proposal, it would be, this is great, this is a good idea, but why don't you write a memoir? But the thing is, I don't have a memoir to write about rape because rape hasn't been the main thing in my life. So I kept avoiding it until, I guess, not so long ago, I thought I would write a book of essays. And when I sent it to an editor in India, she wrote back and said, why don't you write a memoir? And I was really irritated. And I wrote back a kind of nasty email saying, I don't want to write a memoir about rape. And she wrote back this really intelligent email saying, well, you know, you've been involved with this issue your whole life. Maybe you can ask this question, maybe you can ask that question. And I read the email and I got really excited because it suddenly occurred to me that I don't have to be the rape victim anymore. I can be the rape expert. And so then I came up with the idea for this book, and it's been actually thrilling because it's been a great experience as a writer. It's really challenging to try to write about something so horrifying in a way that people don't run away, and also to talk about all the little tiny nuances that no one really talks about. So I got to do that.
Well, I think also one of the things that I really noticed about reading the book is it's possibly because you have so much distance from it, but you also write about the life that you had after it. So it's very affirming of, yes, you can be raped, but that does not then define the rest of your life. There is life after it, there is a different life after that, and a happy life after that, and that's sort of just implicit in the fact that you've had that. And that, I think, is a really powerful part of the book as well, that memoir quality does bring to it.
Right.
Was that deliberate, or was that just happened as you were writing it?
I think that's just me. It just came out. It became, I was writing, and even though, it's so funny because a memoir is when you write stories about yourself. And I didn't want to do that. But in a funny way, this book is more about myself than a memoir would be, because when you write about something so intense and you talk to so many people, your attitude is what comes out. So it's not about my life or about events. There's probably 3 or 4 pages that are really about me. But it's about it's like my manifesto for living.
Was that how it started out? Did you have that as a plan when you started?
Not at all.
So you don't start, writers start with, some people actually dot point everything and then just go in and fill it all in. And others just sit down and start typing and have no idea where they're going to go. And the rest of us are sort of somewhere in between. Where do you fit on that spectrum?
I was definitely in between because, see, when I got my book deal, it ended up being somebody in the UK, fabulous publisher. And they said, well, in order to sign the contract, we have to have a chapter outline. So I just kind of made up a chapter outline. And I sent it to them. And then it was time to do the book. I didn't want to do some plodding research nonstop, and I was scared to be bound by having to do either an encyclopedic academic book. I didn't want to be bound by either the memoir thing. So I kind of cleverly made it like, it's just going to be a book. It's going to be my thoughts. And then I did do, some research, not huge amount. But what I did do was I called up everybody I know, and I know a lot of people, and I said, I'm writing this book on rape. So I knew that I had some things I wanted to say. That was very clear. I didn't start off as a blank slate. I knew there were points I wanted to make, but I also wanted to just kind of see where things went. So, and then it was amazing because all kinds of strange things happened. The first thing that happened, just for one example, is that I called my friend Sarah McNally. She owns a bookstore in New York, and she's a big fan. And I said, I'm writing a book. She said, that's amazing. You must write it. And it's so interesting that you called because my friend Yasmin is visiting from Cairo. And she is great. You should talk to her. So I called up Yasmin and we met. And Yasmin ended up becoming a huge part of the book because she is this person who began an organization called Opantish. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It was during the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square. There were these big protests. And one of the things that happened is that there were a lot of gang rapes of women. Men used to corner women and rape them, and sometimes with knives. It was awful. So Yasmin and her friends, and Yasmin is this tiny little skinny person. They got together and decided they wanted to put a stop to it. They formed a group. They trained themselves. They used to go into the mobs. They used to save women. It was just so heroic and amazing. And so that I talked to her and I sort of couldn't believe that she existed. And then that made me realize I need to write a chapter on heroes. So I did that. Then again, I talked to my friend Irene, who lives here in Melbourne, and she said, well, I just met this dentist who really specializes in treating trauma victims. And I thought, a dentist? And then there's a whole chapter on dentistry, which led to, which is not as irrelevant as it sounds, because the chapter is actually about how we really put trauma in this little box, not just for rape, but for anything else. We have these assumptions. Like for rape, the assumption is that now you're going to have trouble with sex. That's the assumption, but you're not. If instead you're having flashbacks to the dentist, you feel crazy. So I wanted to open up that discussion about the after effects.
And it does make sense if you think about it, that we've all got a horror of going to the dentist. Well, most people. Yeah, dentists are like spiders. Nobody really likes them. Sorry if there's any dentists in the audience. We love you. But it's also quite invasive, having somebody coming into you like that, and they're going to hurt you. So if you are suffering trauma and we carry that in our bodies as well as our minds, that, of course it does make sense once you think about it, but it was one of the many things in your book that I was just thinking, this is so obvious, but these things always are if you've never thought of them before.
Right.
And many of these things you could just go, oh yes, of course, that makes perfect sense, but I just hadn't thought about it like that before or seen it conceptualized like that before. Like even that sentence that I read out before, of course, yes, I know that and I've written about that, but I haven't seen it summed up so perfectly. And there were so many sentences, the whole book's marked through with highlighters and pencil marks. I'm one of those people. But the book is full of sentences like that. And again, I strongly recommend it, because one of the other things that really struck me in that was when you're talking about shame, and that shame is one of the universal responses to being raped. It crosses age, gender, cultural lines, regardless of the circumstances or the perpetrator. Almost all victims feel shame, and we can intellectually know that the shame belongs only to the rapist. But it's an odd thing that it's the one crime that victims really take on that shame.
Yeah.
And you do talk about in the book, but I wonder if you can talk a bit about why victims of rape take that shame onto themselves and rapists almost never do.
Yeah, I don't really understand. I talk about it, but I don't really understand. It seems like shame is a very useful emotion to have, but the wrong party has it in this instance. It should be on the perpetrator should be feeling ashamed, and maybe some do, but many don't even know what they've done. How's that? Yeah, but I think that it does cut across cultures, and I'm not sure why. I can only speak about my own culture, and I've counseled lots of Americans, so I can speak to that too. But I think it's partly the mixture of the confusion of rape and sex. And as people and society, we have a lot of shame about sex. And while we say that rape is not sex, and it's not, it's a sexual act, and anything to do with that, we're ashamed and weirded out and uncomfortable. So then you feel ashamed. And also, if you've been told all your life that it's your job as a woman to control men and their behavior is your responsibility, then obviously someone happens to you, you should be ashamed because you did it. We all carry around this message that, it's up to us. And even if it's not so blatant as cover your head or they're going to rape you, it's like, well, if they take you out to a really fancy dinner and they spend so much money on you and you've been sort of leading them on, then if they want something, maybe you should give it to them.
You kind of owe it to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I guess leads on to the next thing. I just want to check, can everybody hear us okay? Yep, good, okay. So the other thing that I've noticed, so there's the shame that the victims themselves feel, but when we're talking about it in the media or public debate in movies, TV shows, everywhere, so often the focus is on the victim's choices. What she was wearing, what she was doing, did he buy, did she get a free dinner? Was she being flirty? Was she walking home by herself? What did she do that caused it? And we almost never talk about what the rapist did that caused it, which is obviously the only thing that causes rape is him and his choices, and that is almost always men. Can you talk a bit about the things that you think actually cause rape? There's all the things we know don't cause it. What does cause it?
Men.
Yeah. Not all men.
Short answer, yeah. Not all men, but rapists. Rapists
Yeah.
cause rape.
So what's the difference between the men that do and the men that don't? Why? What's different?
Well, see, that's the thing. I don't know that there's a huge difference in who the person is. I think that's part of the mistake we make, is putting it out there and saying there's a certain kind of person. And I always have to particularly emphasize this because I'm sitting here and I'm actually a survivor of exactly the kind of rape that I keep saying is not the typical rape. Because my situation is the kind of the Bollywood rape where there were weapons and there were strangers and there was wounds, and it was just that kind of awful thing. And that happens. But the majority of rapes are, who are these men? They're regular guys. They're regular husbands and fathers. Some don't know that what they're doing is rape. Some are husbands, so think, depending on which country they are correctly, that they can do what they want. So I don't know what the difference is, except that you make a choice. And that's why I think that it's really important to talk about sex at the same time as rape, because what are we teaching people about sex? If we're teaching sex education or sex ethics to boys and girls in such a way that they come to regard sex as something men can take and men can enjoy, and women, it's really for them to just put up with, then we're really encouraging rape. And so, there are plenty of rapists out there who are great guys in other ways. So it's hard. I wish I could say these men are different, but I don't think so. I think it's a potential in everyone. It's a choice everyone could make. And many don't.
I agree. It's I don't know. Certainly don't know the numbers for India, but I know I've done the numbers for Australia. If you are living in Australia and you know 8 men, you know a rapist. How's that for making everybody feel comfortable? So, looking out at this audience, who will look wonderful, and I'm sure none of those 1 in 8 are here tonight, but one of the things I always notice at these events, and we were saying before that it's not quite the same in India, but the majority of the people here are women. And women are not really the problem here. They are often, but not always, the victims, but they are almost never the perpetrators of rape. And we need men to get involved in this discussion and be talking to each other about it to change these decisions that you were just talking about. How do you get men involved? Because so often when we try and have these conversations, they get defensive. And I made the not all men joke before because somebody had to do it tonight. But that is the response to, but not all men, not me. Don't say that about me. It's a very defensive response. And actually we need them to listen and understand and listen to people like you talk about the difference between sex and rape. How do we do that?
Well, I think the way, I don't think it works to then have a panel and expect people to come, because it might not be something at the top of their minds or something that they choose to do or they feel comfortable doing. But for me, in my life, first of all, it's not anyone's one responsibility to go out there and transform either women or men or anything. No one needs to take that on and not live life. But it is an important issue. And in my life, the way I do it is that I just start with the people I know. I mean, say I'm in the audience at an event like this, and the next day I'm meeting a friend, a male friend, I might talk about it with them and see where that goes. Or I might write about it. But I don't think that we can expect someone who is defensive or in denial in some way to then show up at an event that's specifically, that it has to be more sideways and tangential.
So have you had conversations with men who are about rape who get defensive about it?
Yeah, because this is a real unfortunate side effect of writing a book about it. Because unless you lie, and I realized too late that I should lie. Like if you go to a party. I mean, it was really actually very interesting because while I was writing the book, anytime I was at a party, people would say, oh, you're a writer and what you're writing? And I'd say, I'm writing a book. What's it about? Rape. And then either it would be like horror or they'd say something or, so, yeah.
And so how did you deal with it when you were getting those responses?
Well, depending on my mood, because sometimes I wasn't in the mood. But mostly, like in Jaipur, I was at the literature festival, and I was sharing a table with an older Indian man, and he said, "Oh, you're a writer," and I said, "Yes. What did you write? What did you write?" And I said, "I wrote about." Why all the books are about women? Why aren't they about men? I said it is about men, actually. So the thing is, you just have to go at it sideways. But I feel like if you want to be angry and yell, you should. But it doesn't really work to be angry and yell. It's just too bad because we are angry and we should yell. But there are just ways, and also the other thing is that this actually was a question I got in Jaipur a lot from young men saying, what can we do, what can we do? And the thing is, what can you do is not a small little box of go out and educate people about rape or go march in the streets. Because what are we talking about with rape? We're talking about an entire culture of a way that men treat women and that we all treat each other. And so it's, you're also you're doing education if you have a girl and a boy, and in India, there's a very common thing that you serve the boy food first. So you could go out and be marching in the streets and demonstrating against rape, but if you come in and you give your son the first helping, it's canceling everything you've done. So in your own little way, I feel like, in my mind, if we live life with the attitude that all human beings deserve a certain basic respect, you don't even have to talk about rape, really, because that's where it begins.
Comes back to that thing you were saying before about the choices
that
rapists make.
And we all feed into those weird stereotypes. We're all kind of mesmerized by patriarchy, and we don't know what we're doing. Not just men, but women too. So I feel like it doesn't have to be this big difficult. Okay, I'm stuck with it. I have to talk about rape because now I wrote this book. But everyone doesn't have to. You can actually do something without going quite so blatant.
You're absolutely right, and I will fess up and say in my house I do have a son and a daughter, and I was mortified when they were 10 and 12 to realise that my daughter was doing the dishes and my son was taking the bins out. And I hadn't even thought about it until she pointed out to me and went, "Some feminist you are," and I went, "Oh God, yes, you're right, whoops." So you're right that those daily things, but it's also, we're so indoctrinated with this stuff and we've been taught since we were so little that it's really difficult to even see it in ourselves unless somebody points it out. And maybe that's where those public debates are useful, to point those things out.
Yeah. No, I'm not at all saying it's not useful. I'm just saying it's not useful for everyone.
Yeah. Because there's also the ones where you just have to go, just no, go away.
Yeah.
Yes, I know those guys too. So speaking of social media, let's move on and talk about that, because I think that's a really interesting space when you're talking about rape. That some of it can be utterly toxic. And I'm sure you must get some. You're on Twitter, you must get abuse. Well, you're on Twitter, you're a woman, of course you get abused. But it's also a really powerful space for positive conversations. And I think that sometimes the showing people what the abuse looks like and how often it happens can also be really powerful for the people that don't use social media or don't use it that way, to say, hey, look at what's happening to women all the time. But, it's a real seesaw, because some of it's abusive and then you get these things thrown at you. I know there's a whole lot of people at the moment in Australia traumatised by the reporting of Cardinal Pell's conviction and all the commentary that's going on about that, finding that very, very difficult to deal with. So there's a real balance there. Where do you fall? Do you think overall benefit or
Well, I'm not exactly the right person to ask, because I'm not really much on social media. I just started tweeting because my publisher told me I should tweet. So now I do, but I'm not on Facebook, and there is abuse, but seems to me like, if I get something nasty, I just then block that person. So they're gone, because I feel like, why should I pay attention to this? But I think it's easy to denigrate social media because there are so many things wrong with it. But I also think back to me at age 17, thinking I'm the only woman in the world who's ever been raped. That would not happen now. That just wouldn't happen, because if it happened to you, no matter how isolated you felt, you would at least know that there are other people out there. And that in itself is a huge, powerful thing. So I think, it's like any technology. It can be used one way or the other way. People also talk a lot about the Me Too movement and how it's got many flaws. But the fact is, it exists. It's really powerful to be able to say, even anonymously under the covers at night, Me Too. I can't imagine. I mean, for me, I said it in public. But everyone can't say it in public. So I feel like, of course, I think social media is evil. I don't want my daughter on it. But I do think it has its purpose. And it's changed the world for better or for worse.
Yeah, I
just
agree.
don't know which. Yeah.
I think a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a... But it's always interesting to hear people's thoughts on it, because it's such a prevalent thing in most people's lives now.
And actually, there was a point which I never thought of, but last night I was on a panel with Soraya Shimali, who was here a couple nights ago, and she made a great point about social media, where she said that, look, the fact is that for the first time, men are seeing these stories, the stories that we only sometimes either told each other or no one at all, that it's not possible to be a man on any kind of internet, media, cyberspace now and not see this. So for better or for worse, it's a public thing that men are also being exposed to. And that's, many men honestly had no idea what our lives are like, about living in fear, about worrying about being raped. They had no idea, but now they do. So that is a good thing.
I agree. Which brings me to the next question, which I think is a fascinating one, because if you look back at what feminists were doing in the 70s,
right,
where they were talking a lot about rape and about the effect on women, and there was that huge movement that started a lot of the law reform that we've had and everything. 40 years later, it feels like we're having the same conversations and doing the same thing. And sometimes I can't help but wonder, even when I see the changes happening, whether our daughters are going to be doing the same thing again in 40 years' time. Or are there differences with what we're doing now to what happened back in the 70s?
I think there are some differences. I wish there was a way to know whether the differences actually have resulted in even one less rape. Because it's like Me Too, it's a fantastic thing. And people are talking about it, which is amazing, especially in a place like India, where people are now really talking about rape every day. This is unbelievable to me. But has it stopped anything? Has it actually changed attitudes deep down? I don't know. So I don't know the answer, but I think we'll always be struggling and fighting about something. I think it changes bit by bit, and there's no one thing that happens that transforms the whole world completely. It's like you have these moments. Me Too was a moment. In India, Jyoti Singh was a moment. But you can point out to that person or that moment and say that changed everything. But it's never in a vacuum. It's like apartheid didn't end because of Nelson Mandela. It ended, he was there and he was a big part of it, but all these things happened that led up to it. So I think it's all these little tiny things, and we see these milestones and we get excited. So I'm sure our daughters will still be fighting, but maybe it'll be a little different. And certainly we don't live the same lives our mothers lived.
True.
Some things are better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with that too, because often what we've seen before with social movements is they're geographically isolated. But the Me Too and it's global. I mean, it's Brazil and Mexico and India and China and Europe and America. So it really has spread, which I think, I mean, tell me what you think, but I think has a lot to do with social media. That's what's made it the global thing.
It has everything to do with it.
Yeah.
It has everything to do with it. And again, it's so funny how it spreads, but then all kinds of false, weird things also spread. Like in India, it's very exciting about Me Too, and in fact, a bunch of women asked me they're very worried about backlash on men and innocent men. There's this whole thing about, well, Me Too will affect these poor innocent men whose careers will be ruined, but I don't really see them. I don't know where these innocent men are whose careers have been ruined. So, and there's this real fear, so we still, no matter what happens, we still, we don't want to hurt the poor men. And I just don't see where it's happening, but it's being perpetrated, this whole myth. And it's interesting to me that women are the protectors of men in this case. It happened in France. There were all those articles by Catherine Deneuve and everyone saying, don't make sex unsexy, don't talk about this stuff. Whereas I think sex is a lot more sexy if you're not worried someone's going to rape you. So...
yes, sex where both people are really enjoying it. How awful that we're making men do that. Sorry, men. Well, that's also an interesting one with what you were saying before about the global thing also, that it's we're also now talking about vulnerable groups in ways that we never have before. So in Australia, trying to bring, say, trans women into the conversation, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in Australia are something like 30 times more likely to suffer violence than white women in Australia. And sometimes I feel like it's tokenistic, that there'll be a line at the bottom of an article or just a nod to it, but actually bringing those voices and those experiences into the mainstream because they are part of our society, and that's how we should understand them. They tend to get siloed. So that's where we talk about the trans people, and that's where we talk about Aboriginal people, and that's where we talk about women with disabilities, and then there's the mainstream for the rest of us, which is basically white women. But it needs to be a conversation about all of us, recognising those extra vulnerabilities, but also seeing it as a common experience that all women happen, and that's a very complicated line to walk.
Yeah, but I also think that just even saying that bring them into our sphere is sort of, again, doing the same thing, because it's like saying Me Too. In India, there's this whole thing about, Me Too is just an urban movement, we've got to bring in the rural women. But that's still the attitude that we, few people who are white and in the West or urban and elite in India, we are the pioneers of this movement and we know the answers. Whereas the fact is that whatever these Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal women in India, and these people have been dealing with these issues forever and ever, and they actually have a lot to teach us.
But that's what I mean by bringing those voices. Not we tell their stories, but we bring their stories into our broader understanding of this is actually part of our experience.
Right.
This is everybody's experience. But if we're only hearing about this one, there's a whole range of experiences that we don't know about that need to be part of this debate.
Yeah.
And trying to do that gets difficult because, I mean, you see it all the time, just really simple stuff like Facebook shares. You can share an article about something that's happened to a white woman and it'll go off. You share an article about something that's happened to Aboriginal women and people say, but that doesn't apply to me. They're not like me. That's a different story. That's a story for other Aboriginal women. It's not a story for all of us, and it is a story for all of us, but it's a difficult concept because it gets complicated with understanding the extra vulnerabilities, but also making it part of the whole story.
It is, and I agree, but also remember that that happens with every rape case. It doesn't matter if I'm an Indian and there's another Indian who's a Muslim from Bombay who's the same age, who had the same thing. If she reads my story, she will still say that wouldn't happen to me. So it's something that it's compounded by if someone has a different color skin or they're in a different place or caste. But with sexual violence, it happens anyway. We do this. We always like to put the person in the other because it's too scary to think it could be us. We always make it. In fact, that's one of my main points in the book is that stop doing that because what's the point of doing that? So I agree that it's a larger social issue, but it's the exact same issue between two people in the same family even.
Yeah.
So we to deal with one, you have to deal with the other. Like why is it that we want to put it out there? We want rapists out there and we want other rape victims out there. We just don't want it to come into our space because it's just too horrifying. But it's here.
And it is, and that's an interesting one too, that thing of it's so horrifying that it's something that we do understand as being a different form of violence to physical violence or financial violence or emotional violence. We understand they're all distinct. They can often be perpetrated by the same person in the same relationship, but we understand them distinctly. And there is something about sexual violence that I think comes back to the shame thing we were talking before. Do you want to talk, because you do write about that in the book, about the combination of violences, but the particular effect of rape.
Well, it is a physical violence. I mean, rape is a physical violence, and I guess it's so complicated because I'm trying very hard to say, and I really believe that it's a crime like any other crime, and yet it's not. but it's unique. Every crime is unique. Rape is not more unique than other unique crimes. So you kind of go around in circles there. But if you get mugged, that's a unique crime. There's a whole thing about being mugged that's different. You lose your money, you lose your confidence, you don't want to walk on the street at night. The same thing happens with rape, but it's so tied up in our minds with honor and shame and blah and sex and being spoiled, and also then as a person who's been raped, you tread a really fine line, because if you feel and behave broken, then you're broken and you're useless. But if you smile and say, I'm kind of happy that I'm alive, then it's really easy to turn around and say it wasn't a big deal. But we judge it. It's the one crime where we judge according to how the victim reacts. And that's so unfair. If you steal $80 from me or from someone who has more money, then you're still stealing $80. But if you rape two different people, then immediately it's judged by the person to whom it happened. So it's really, it is different, but it's only different because we make it different. And so my whole shtick here is that don't make it so different. By bringing it into the realm of terrible traumas like other terrible traumas, you're not diminishing it or saying it's less. You're just saying it's as manageable or not as other things. If you are raped and you commit suicide, that's awful, and that happens. And if you are raped and you go on to have a happy life, that's great. But the rape is still a crime.
Yes, it was something that you wrote about that I found fascinating, was that idea that once somebody is raped, that is then what they become. They are a rape victim. That becomes part of their identity, right, often in other people's perceptions and sometimes in their own perceptions. But if somebody had exactly what you were just saying, if you were mugged once, you would not always be the person who got mugged that time.
Plus, it would be a great party story.
Yes, exactly.
Which being raped is not.
No,
yeah.
Rarely. Rarely,
yeah.
No.
It's true. But, it's interesting, actually, the narrative we put around rape, and you and I are both in the media, so we know how it is. And no matter, you have to really feel what you believe, and the media, I think, has a huge role to play in perpetuating stereotypes of rapists and victims. So I was in Jaipur, like I said, a couple months ago in the literature festival, and I had this big session about my book, and I had been really nervous about taking it to India because there's a lot of hostility, and I just was nervous. And hundreds of people came, and we had this amazing session where we talked about the book, and one of the things we talked about a lot was how rape is survivable, and, I've had this happy life, blah, blah, blah. And the audience was great. They asked millions of questions. It was a great session. We even joked because the moderator happened to be a friend of mine. It all went well, and I felt very good about it. Then the next day, I was in the airport, and I picked up the local Hindi paper, and I saw this. I was very excited to see my photo, except my photo, I looked like this. I looked really sad and depressed, and the headline said, "Rape victim lives under the shadow of fear." And it was completely. Yeah. So they came with this idea, and if I'm not dead, I should at least be afraid.
Yeah. Yeah. Or traumatized.
Yeah.
And still suffering from what's happened to
you.
So
we all play into this, and then we have to be really careful because we also don't want to be like, oh, you're fine, it's behind you, because we shouldn't do that for any trauma or
But
grief.
then it's also like they get angry with you if you recover. There's almost but how dare you? You're not supposed to be able to get over this, but also you're not supposed to whine about it. So find a way to do those.
And in countries like Muslim countries or or in India, it becomes a family matter because if you can't get over it because your whole family's dishonored. So it's not just you; it's everybody. So there's no way you're getting over it.
You had a very supportive family, though, didn't you? You wrote in the book your immediate family was very supportive. It's one of the things that we talk about in Australia a bit now that I wanted to ask you was because we are talking about rape more. Obviously, it's very confronting for people who have been raped, but it can also be difficult for people who haven't, who are listening to those stories and are frightened by it because of all the things that we've been talking about. So they don't know what to say. What's the response that I should have when somebody just suddenly tells me a story like this? And people can come out with some terrible things that either out of ignorance or surprise or wanting to try and ease a very uncomfortable moment. I know of one girl who unfortunately tried to make a joke not a thing you should make a joke about at that time.
Well, unless you're the victim, then you're allowed
yes,
to.
but
Yeah.
you tell your close
Yeah.
friend this terrible story and she tries to lighten the mood with a joke. That's not quite the way to do it, and she certainly didn't mean it that way. And she
Right.
was horrible, but she didn't know what to do. So as somebody who had a supportive people around you and have now got this wonderful life that you've got, and also you've talked to a lot of rape victims, what are the sort of things that you think are helpful to say in that situation?
Should I read that thing? I have a page of guidelines. I don't know where it is. Let me just look for it.
Here's one we didn't prepare earlier.
Yeah, 75. Should I? It's
Yeah,
quick,
I think it's a good idea. That's why I brought it up. I should have just marked the page for you, though.
So, the first thing I want to say is like anything else, where you know how uncomfortable it is when you're talking to someone who's grieving. You want to say the right thing, but you don't know what to say. So the first thing to do is just remember it is another bad thing. It's not the only bad thing. Anyway, I wrote these guidelines. They're called the Abdulali Guidelines for Saving a Rape Survivor's Life. I say she, but the guidelines apply equally to all genders. Be horrified, but don't fall off your chair so that she has to take care of you. Believe her. No ifs, ands, or buts. Just believe her. Let her take the lead. If she wants to talk, okay. If she wants to be quiet, okay. If she wants to cry, okay. If she wants to joke, okay. If she wants to throw things, okay. Ask her what she wants. No need to guess. Encourage her to get help. Medical, legal, physical, mental. But don't force it. Don't ask her for details, but let her know you're open to listening if she wants to elaborate. Don't question her judgment. Let her frame it the way she wants in the words she chooses. Don't try to understand and analyze. Just be there. Remember, this is the same person you knew before you knew she was raped. Treat her the same. Something terrible has happened to her, but she is the same person. She might also need reminding of this. And last but not least, I could give no advice better than Caitlin Moran's. Don't be a dick.
I think that should be its own little post somewhere that's shareable because everybody in the world should read that so that the next time they hear one of those stories, they know how to respond because of that. I think that's ideal. I might actually even do that. I'll talk to you about it later. So, which brings me on to the last question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. That you said in the book that after that New York Times article, you got thousands of emails from survivors and you answered all of them, which, wow. So you don't need to sleep then.
No, I slept plenty.
But taking on those stories, reading all those stories and then responding to them, and I know it doesn't just stop there. A lot of them you can get into conversations with, and I know a lot of those people ended up being stories in the book.
Right.
But how do you take on those stories and not take on the emotional weight of it? Or did you at times?
Well, I was lucky because I had worked long ago at a rape crisis center, so I kind of knew about how to do that. But I also, I was so surprised that I got all these emails because of that one article, and I was also surprised because they were from everywhere. I got so many from Denmark, and I was so, in my head, it was so stereotypical. Those women are fine. Even I thought that, but I got all these emails, and it just felt really disrespectful to not acknowledge, especially the people who had never told anyone. But I didn't really get into conversations. I was really careful. What I did was I wrote back to everyone, the people who told me stories. I responded appropriately, but I kind of made it clear that that's it. I can't be the one to be your counselor or whatever. And then I did what turned out to be really great for me, but I couldn't bring myself to erase them because I just couldn't. And so I put them all in a file and put them away. And then 5 years later, when I was going to write this book, I realized I had this massive database that I hadn't planned on. And so I went back through them and I looked for the ones who hadn't written me in extreme trauma, and ones who didn't say I was the only one because I'd ever told, because I didn't want to 5 years later come back and scare them to death by suddenly appearing. So I found a bunch who seemed like they had, even when they written to me, they had kind of come to some kind of closure. And I wrote and said, I'm writing this book, do you want to talk to me about it? And many said yes. So I met some, and some I talked to on phone or Skype. So that's how I found survivors in all kinds of ways, but that was one of the main ways.
And how were you affected by talking to them about it? Did you find it emotionally difficult?
Well, I was really surprised, actually, because I was dreading it a bit. Because it is hard to listen to stories. And I remembered being at the Rape Crisis Center and how it used to be to talk to people who were, in the worst state of their lives. But what I forgot is that these people were not. So these people were all like me. They were all people who something awful had happened to them, and in whatever way they had dealt with it. And they were living lives. Some were not living good lives, some were living bad lives, but they were living. And so it was actually really inspirational. It was really nice to talk to these people and hear how they had come through it. And they all had some horrifying stories, and they all had some amazing stories. And in fact, how I sort of made my chapters depending on what happened. So this was one of the things that the first 4 people I talked to, I think all from different countries, each one had a story of what happened to her or him. I don't remember if one of them was a man. And then they would tell someone really close to them, and that person would turn around and say, what did you expect? What did you expect? You went into the bar. I mean, they were very sympathetic, but really, what did you think would happen? Why did you open the door? Why did you? So then I knew I had to write a chapter called What Did You Expect? And so they taught me a lot, but it wasn't it wasn't a downer, because even though it was heavy, it's always good to talk to someone.
Yeah. So can I just ask everybody to say thank you very much.
Thank
you. Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.